President of the United States for a second time. He's been given an unconditional discharge. So, you know, good for him.
Good for him. I mean, it's an extraordinary story.
It's a bizarre story.
It is a bizarre story. And they talk about the
far
fact
more about politics than justice, I think.
Well, yes, they said they couldn't actually press any charges because he's an incoming president of the United States.
Well, he's been convicted, but they couldn't exactly send him to prison.
Well, they couldn't. No, absolutely. I mean, it is an extraordinary story. Peter, I hope the show goes very well. What a surprise to see you.
I know. Who'd have thought?
Who'd have thought? Thank you ever so much for your company. I shall be back tomorrow, starting all over again at 6 o'clock. Peter Cardwell is up next. This is Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, a very good morning. I'm Peter Cardwell. Thank you so much for your company here on Talk. I'm here between now and midday today. Slightly shorter programme because of the football. But listen, thank you so much for tuning in. I want to get your voice on the air within the next couple of hours because there's so much to talk about. Rachel Reeves is in China. Is that going to mean that we get a huge amount of investment? Are we going to get the Chinese investing, getting the growth in the UK economy? I wonder. But the story I'm most interested in this morning is Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary. He says that grooming gang rhetoric risks inciting mass violence. He's given an interview to who else? The Guardian, saying that there are people in my community who have either Pakistani heritage or look different who are now more fearful today than they were before. He says he has no difficulty or qualms calling out sickening crimes of sexual abuse gangs, criticising well-meaning but fundamentally misguided and warped views of political correctness. Well, what do you make of what he has to say? I want to bring the focus back not just on politics, but also on the victims of this, the people who are, to this day, being raped. The children at the heart of this, and that's why we're going to talk to Jim Gamble in a second. You're definitely going to want to hear what he says. He's the former head of the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command Centre within the National Crime Agency. So we'll talk about things that have been achieved, things that haven't been achieved, because there's so much more work to do. We've got on the debate desk today Joe Wheeler, by popular demand. Joe has been on talking about the weather at numerous points, but there are many, many other tools in her armoury, and she will be giving her political views, commentating on the news of the day. So Joe Wheeler's coming up in about 20 minutes' time alongside Maxwell Marlowe, who's another political commentator. They'll be on the debate desk this morning. We'll also talk about Number 10 plots billions in disability welfare cuts to ease the debt crisis. We know that debt is so expensive. Also, there's only a week of gas supply left, so we will be talking about Ed Miliband and the eco-Marxists, as some people call them. Also, what does an unconditional discharge actually mean? Donald Trump in 9 days' time will become president of the United States again. How is that all going to work out, and what does it mean, crucially, for the United Kingdom as well? Loads to discuss. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. Tommy's on the phones today. You give him a ring, you make your point. We'll get as many people on air between now and 12 o'clock. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text. You can tweet me at talkTV or follow me at Peter Cardwell. Remember, the main number does three things. You can send me a voice note, you can send me a WhatsApp text message, or you can give me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Let's get started here on Talk. Well, Wes Streeting has given an interview today. He says he's been among those at the forefront of the government's response to Elon Musk. It was, of course, Elon Musk's many tweets, over hundreds of tweets, literally over 200 tweets on British politics in the last sort of 10 days or so, that has meant that people are talking again about this story. I think quite a number of media outlets have dropped the ball on this and are talking about it simply through politics. And listen, I'm a political specialist, as most people know. I talk about politics almost every day of the week. It's what's fascinated me since I was a young boy. But what we need to remember in all of this is not just a political row. It's about the people, the women, the children at the centre of this. And that's why I want to talk to Faye Maxted, who's Chief Executive of the Survivors Trust. But first, I want to talk to Jim Gamble, who's a child safeguarding specialist. And there's a lot of questions around, I think, how the police deal with this, how they have dealt with this, what the National Crime Agency has done or not done. But Jim has dedicated his professional life to this as the former head of the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command Centre within the National Crime Agency. Jim, I'm sure you don't want to get involved in the political row, and I'm not asking you to do so, but what do you make of the debate in the last sort of 10 days or so? How informed has it been? Because we have a load of viewers and listeners who are really, really worried about this, who think it's a huge problem, who want politicians to deal with it. Some people calling for a national inquiry, some people saying local inquiries are a better thing, or alternatively, in some people's view, just for the police to do their job. What is your take on the last 10 days or so, Jim?
Well, I think it's been really interesting, and whilst I don't agree with the way in which, or the language, in fact, that Elon Musk has used, and I think it's for others to decide, but some of it, to me, if it was coming from a citizen within this country, would in fact be considered potentially criminal. But it has highlighted the issue, and it has accelerated a contemporary debate within it. And of course, as you've already said, different sides of the political spectrum have weaponized it. That said, I have some sympathy with what Wes Streeting is saying. I think we need to be careful that what we're going to do here is target the criminal activity, not target particular communities. And if you look at group-based offending, the vast majority of that statistically is going to come from groups of white men predominantly. So there are trends and themes and patterns, and we can't ignore them. But the principal trend or theme that you need to consider is that victims are always going to be coercively controlled. Their vulnerability is going to be enhanced. The abnormal is going to be normalized to the point whereby they no longer recognize that they're victims. And that creates a difficulty. And from the perpetrator's point of view, they minimize, they self-justify, and they blame others. So they will use and abuse anything, whether it's their own perverted view of a cultural belief that says, well, this is okay because this is a lesser person. That's classic minimization, and it's something that cannot be ignored. But it happens across the board in all types of communities. And when you talk about gangs, I mean, young people are being sexually exploited by criminal gangs across the UK, and I include Northern Ireland. And in Northern Ireland, that's not going to be from Pakistani, British Pakistani men. That's going to be from those who operate in environments, within the criminal fraternity, where they're able to apply coercive control without actually trying, because some young people are so vulnerable they'll feel safer under their wing.
Tell us a bit about that, actually. Just drill down a little bit to that, Jim, because I'm fascinated when you say people, I've written down your words here, no longer recognise they are victims. How can someone how can a child get to that? They're emotionally manipulated, they're obviously physically manipulated as well, but the emotional, psychological manipulation, just tell us a little bit about how the gangs work in that regard, because I find that both horrifying and fascinating, and I think a lot of people watching and listening will wonder about that, and I wonder if you just tell us a bit more about that.
Well, I'm happy to do that. What I say, you've got someone coming on to speak about survivors, and I think their words will be more credible than mine. But having spoken and worked with a number of survivors of this particular crime type, you're talking about young people who at a particular time in their life feel alienated or isolated, perhaps from family, perhaps from friends, and the greatest gift that a groomer, and that's what these people do, they groom them, can provide, isn't money. It's actually friendship, making them feel that they're part of something, making feel that you're one of us. And whether that's a gang in London operating on the fringes, or directly involved in drugs and drug trafficking, or county lines moving drugs across the country, or a gang that are identifiable by their ethnicity, who are working together, in that type of environment, they bring you in. They make you feel special. You're now one of us. You belong. You've got the protection of the group. And as they do that, they begin to normalize abnormal behavior. Of course, providing sexual favors to them. Well, that's normal. That's what we do. That's who we are. To the point where I've had victims, and survivors of this awful abuse tell me that they'd really lost track of what was right and what was wrong. And it was only in one case that I can think of, and I won't name the young person, but they wrote a really powerful book where they actually had to be removed for a significant period of time before they could look back and see how they'd been exploited. Because one of the things they told me is the person that prevented social care from engaging, that prevented the police from taking effective action at that critical moment in time, was me, because I believed that I was part of this. And that's part of the seduction and the grooming that goes on, whereby young people make it more difficult. And I'm not blaming them, because the problem is there's too much victim blaming goes on. So we've got to understand that when you're dealing with a victim, first and foremost in these cases, you've got to get beyond their reticence to engage. That may be because it's been normalized, it may be because of fear, and it may be because of fear for their family or others. So it's extremely complex, and it is ruining lives, and these young victims carry a legacy of pain. But it happens everywhere. You have this debate about how many cities is it happening in. Well, if you want to identify cities by ethnicity, then you're starting from the wrong place. How many cities are children being exploited in? And the answer to that is every city.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on whether a national inquiry is a good idea, a local inquiry, whether, I've absolutely no doubt, I have not a scintilla of doubt that you at every point in your career, Jim, have done your job, but is the police in general doing its job? Because there are a lot of people who are worried about this. You've talked about victims and police being able to do their job effectively, but is there a grip on this?
I don't think there is the type of total grip that there should be, and let me explain why. You talk about CEOP and you talk about it being part of the National Crime Agency Command. Well, actually, it wasn't in my day. I resigned because CEOP was being dissolved and actually assimilated into the NCA, and I thought that was wrong. Because when we first built CEOP, actually under the former Labour government, it was built to be the one place where safeguarding children was the priority, not a priority amongst many. So within the institutions that deliver safeguarding, including social care, education, health, and of course policing, there would be one place that aggregated knowledge. We had the first missing desk, and we understood that going missing, and the longer you're missing, means the greater the chance is that you're going to suffer more and more exploitation. But that was politically vandalized when we had an election and the Conservatives came in and decided, no, we're going to push this into our new flagship, the National Crime Agency. And I think that was a fundamental error, because to get this right, you need a holistic approach that begins with education. Yeah. How do we educate and empower children in safe spaces in schools? How do we educate and empower parents? How do we make sure that colleagues in health understand what to look for and what to do when they see it? And of course, there's a piece of work to be done within policing. And I myself, in reviews, have seen in recent years, there's still victim blaming. There's still a reticence to engage and challenge for fear of offending.
But and talking about that engaging and challenging, I wonder specifically, look, statistically, it is a fact that the vast majority of paedophilia that happens in this country is by white men. That is true. But this particular issue is one which Pakistani Muslim gangs are absolutely a part of. It was on a mass scale. The police, the National Crime Agency, some would argue, had no inroads to those communities or intelligence. It was too difficult to penetrate the communities because of the culture, and many of the men are part of the communities that live entirely separately. I just wonder how big that problem was and how that was tackled by you, and also how it can be tackled now.
Well, we tackled it going back to 2010, ending in 2011 when I resigned, by creating an intelligence desk to aggregate all of the information we had regarding vulnerable adolescents and how they could be pathwayed into harm, and how we could provide interdiction strategies and support to local policing. But that was deconstructed on the basis of the political vandalism of the Conservative government when they threw that to one side. So the tactical deployment that occurred since was fundamentally focused on crime. And if you put child protection and safeguarding in amongst multiple agendas that deal with drug trafficking, that deal with borders, you can guess how that prioritization is pushed down the table. No matter what anyone says, I don't accept that that does not happen. I saw it in America, after you had 9/11, when the FBI's Innocent Images Unit, was pulled back into counterterrorism roles. There needs to be somewhere that advocates by, for, on behalf, and with a sole focus on our children and young people. In 2010, just after the Conservative government came in, Contact Point, a database that literally millions of pounds have been spent on, so that anyone from any part of the child safeguarding system could establish where a child was and what other agencies had an interest in them, so they could come together and work collaboratively.
Okay.
That was arbitrarily abolished in the August of the year after they came into power. So there's too much politics at play. And I think on this occasion, we shouldn't default to let's have another review. A review of what? Because we review silos, and that's the way we do it. We review them in isolation. We review...
But I just wonder what you personally, just finally, Jim, what you did in CEOP and in the NCA specifically to investigate Pakistani grooming and rape gangs.
Well, you're talking about, I resigned in 2011. So personally, pre-2011, we began to identify the problem by creating teams within CEOP that were fundamentally child-centred, focusing on learning about why what happened was happening. That's why, if you look today, post all of the multiple reviews that have taken place where it's working well, you've got vulnerable adolescence groups looking at how long children are missing for, gang affiliation and gang association, because radicalization, sexualization, it is all about vulnerability, and vulnerability is extended whenever you haven't got, that good parental oversight. Okay. Those agencies fundamentally focused on what's best for you. So let me finish by saying this. There are hundreds of reports out there. We talk about the J report as if it's a silver bullet. It's not. It deals with some good stuff about registration and about redress. But actually what we need all of the key statutory agencies round a table, round table style, using an aggregated version of all of the reports to say, right, what are the practical solutions? Because where this really falls down is the speed within which criminal justice responds, and the derisory sentencing on occasions. And if you look at this begins at one end with technology, ironically, given what Elon Musk is saying, where people get away for too much for too long, and even when they are caught, less, than 80% of those people caught downloading images. And this will be inextricably linked to everything we've talked about, go to prison.
Yeah. Okay. Well, there are clear problems. Jim, thank you. That's Jim Gamble there. He's a child safeguarding specialist. There are clear problems with how this is dealt with in policing to this day. I want to talk to Faye Maxted now, Chief Executive of the Survivors Trust. Faye, thank you for joining me this morning. What do you make of what Jim was saying there? Because clearly there are major issues. I mean, he's talking historically about the police, and I did want to tackle him a bit more on that. But listen, I suppose the point is that to this day, there are serious issues. And I wonder what you think, in all the noise that we've had over the last 10 days, Faye, where are victims in all of this?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on today. I think there's such a lot of good and positive in what Jim said, and I'm really heartened when I hear him talking about what we need is something that focuses solely on children. And, this is something that the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse included in their recommendations, a Minister for Children and a National Child Protection Authority. The reality is that, we have lost sight of the victims in this, because the children that are sexually exploited grow into adults. They're not getting the support they need. They're not getting the justice they need. And, even worse, we aren't seeing children now being protected in the way that they need to be. So we need to do something really drastic to change things.
Well, what is that drastic action, actually? Because we talked a bit about policing. I'm not sure Jim Gamble, I mean, he was very interesting to talk to, but I'm not sure he gave us too much information about what had actually been done in regard to specifically Pakistani grooming gangs, because this is a cultural problem, it is a crime problem. There's so many different aspects to this, and I wonder if you feel, I suppose I want to ask you, Faye, what you feel the best way to get a grip of this is. Is it an inquiry? Is it just the police doing their job in a better way?
I think, like Jim said, we have had lots of inquiries, we've had lots of reports, multiple recommendations, and few of them have actually been implemented. I think that's the issue with inquiries at the moment. There is no formal process following an inquiry that monitors the implementation of the recommendations. And therefore, we're left with really valid, useful, helpful ways of changing child protection systems that aren't implemented, that aren't monitored across the country, and that's what we need.
And that is a political failure of successive governments. I mean, I've said this a number of times, but the J Review, for example, had 20 different recommendations. 18 of them were accepted by the Conservative government that did nothing in 18 months after the J Review. The Labour government has done nothing in 6 months. What do you think the most important thing to be done to protect children being raped today is, Faye?
I think we need accountability, and we need someone who is directly responsible for representing children at government level, because this is a political issue. It's a major scandal in this country. It's a huge risk for our children and young people, and we need to be really taking strong action. So we need someone at cabinet level who is responsible for representing children. We need a child protection authority.
But we do. I mean, the Education Secretary is responsible for children. Is she doing her job?
She's responsible for a lot of other things too. And I think, we need to make sure that we have a specific focus on child protection and keeping our children safe.
Okay. Faye, how has this been for the victims that you've been speaking to in the last 10 days? Are they happy that people are talking about this, that we're actually trying to tackle it, or are they being re-traumatised by the fact that this has been talked about so much? What is your experience with people, obviously at the Survivors Trust, people you have helped, in regard to the national conversation that's going on here?
I think it's a mixture of reactions, and on the one hand, it's welcomed that the whole issue is back in the news again, back in the media very strongly. On the other hand, it's distressing to look back at all the inquiries and know that the recommendations that would have made a difference haven't been implemented. And as a survivor myself, I could think that's where I'm sitting too. I would like to see some action that does protect children, that makes sure there is support in place for survivors, and that we can really look at the data and see what's happening and take action accordingly.
In as much as you want to, and I don't want to put you on the spot, Faye, but you said you're a victim yourself. Can you tell us what happened to you?
I wasn't sexually exploited by a gang or a grooming gang, but sexually abused at a very young age.
I'm so sorry to hear that, Faye, and thank you for speaking to us this morning. That's Faye Maxted, their Chief Executive of the Survivors Trust. We also heard from Jim Gamble. We'll get the reaction of those on the debate desk. Joe Wheeler is with us, as is Maxwell Marlowe. We'll talk to them in just a minute here on Talk.
I didn't actually create it. My officers created it and the engineers created it.
Right.
And obviously the idea comes from overseas, Holland, where you know there's a culture of walking and cycling. And in England and locally, we need to actually make sure we handle growth sustainably. There's lots of houses being built in the country. 11,000 in Hemel Hempstead planned in the next 5 or so years, 5,000 jobs. And if we rely on the car for everyone to get there, Hemel Hempstead will be an absolute gridlock.
We need to get tough on deporting people who come to our country and then break the law. We need to get really tough like other sensible countries do. And if the law doesn't allow us to do that, then let's change the law. And if international laws don't allow us to do that, then let's derogate from those international laws, because you don't get away with this sort of stuff in other countries. So how is it that Britain has become some...
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, thank you everybody who has been in touch, including Betty, who says, "Morning, Peter. West Reading's comments are inflammatory and clearly show this government has decided that it will side against the 95% of this country on any topic. Luckily, there's only 45,000 left in the army and 100,000 police will side with the people. This government is only interested in the 500 to 1,000 votes in their seats." Well, West Reading is under pressure in his seat. He said the grooming gang's rhetoric risks inciting massacre, streeting. That is the headline in The Guardian today, spoken to them. 528 majority in Ilford South, which is his constituency. The use of inflammatory language over grooming gangs risks vilifying entire communities and could lead to atrocities such as the mosque massacre in New Zealand that killed more than 50 people, according to the Health Secretary. Given everything we've heard so far this morning, Joe Wheeler is with us, the political commentator, meteorologist as well, many strings to her bow, and Maxwell Marlowe, political commentator on the debate desk this morning. I just wonder, where do you think this debate kind of is, Joe? Because I'm hearing a lot of we can't talk about it, or we shouldn't talk about it, or alternatively, this isn't just Pakistani grooming gangs. I mean, it is Pakistani gangs. There is no doubt about that. That is factually correct. And I don't think we should be saying, it's fine to say dial down the rhetoric, or, you know, let's have a sensible conversation about this. But we are having a sensible conversation about this on this station anyway. We're talking about the huge and dreadful and ongoing thing that this is, and people are fed up because you hear about Jim Campbell talking about this happened in 2011, 2010, etc. But we're here in 2025 and this is still a massive problem.
Absolutely. I think the public want honesty and transparency to start with. When Jim was talking about the victims, he said some of them don't know that they're victims. It's coercive control, and they've not realised it. Well, tell that to the girls who went to the police station, whose parents went to the police and said, this has happened, and the police did nothing, the CPS did nothing, and they're still waiting for some kind of justice 15 years later. That is outrageous. In any society, for this to have happened is disgusting. And I think we do want another inquiry. Maxwell was saying that actually he looked at the original one and it's actually quite good, but it's not enough, and we didn't see it. And it's interesting with the Alexis J report because it only mentions Rochdale, I should say. It only actually mentions that once, and it is into sort of paedophilia, child exploitation in general, but specifically on these gangs themselves. Is a national inquiry needed, a local inquiry? I mean, what is the solution here, Maxwell?
I mean, for me, I think there's a very good inquiry. The Ilford inquiry was very good. It was in and out, very quick. The Commissioner went to houses of victims.
Do you mean Telford rather than Ilford?
Oh, sorry, to Telford, yes, the Telford inquiry, sorry. Yeah. But this is the thing. I think you can execute them quickly, but you need the political capital. And what I'm worried about is that essentially the government's guts aren't there to do it. And they still want to implement a lot of the original inquiry's recommendations. The last government didn't implement all of them. I still think there's work to be done there. However, we cannot get around the fact this is a primarily Pakistani grooming gang problem in certain communities, and we need to be very explicit about that, absolutely. However, we shouldn't, make such broad sweeping statements to say that this is all Pakistanis, this is all Muslims, whatever. I mean, speaking to some friends from those backgrounds, they are as horrified as we are. I mean, imagine the shame that it brings to those communities that there are actors going.
But what about the community leaders? Where are the community leaders in all of this? Where are the imams coming out saying, this is totally unacceptable, nobody should facilitate this, nobody should turn a blind eye, this is dreadful stuff? I mean, there does need to be community leadership here. It can't just say, isn't this awful? You've got to be a bit of leadership here, doesn't there, Joe?
So who's going to call for that? Who's going to ask the imams to come out and do that? Because if they don't believe that it's wrong, we need to know that too.
Yes.
We need to understand that. Other than that, we need somebody to convey that message, as you say, to avoid triggering language or inflammatory language. We need somebody to come out and say, this may be predominantly because of Pakistani grooming gangs, but not all Pakistanis are like that, and that's not what they do.
And nobody's suggesting that either.
No.
And there's too much to me anyway. I wonder what you think about this, Maxwell, but there's too much I'm not a racist but kind of language, or, I don't want to be racist, but I'm saying da-da-da-da. And I don't think people are being racist here. If something is a problem with a specific ethnic group, you can call that out and you can say, this is factually a thing. And we have a Wes Streeting, for example, who was, the health secretary, who was part of coming up with a definition around this for an all-party parliamentary group, just a group of MPs over the last a couple of years ago. And the suggestion was even to identify this with the Pakistani community was racist by itself.
Well, it happens on both sides. So that new definition also was the work of Anna Soubry, who was a Tory MP as well. So we see it on both sides of the House, and I think there is concern with politicians. Look, I can understand where Wes is coming from when he talks about political violence, and I know that a lot of MPs are very scared at the moment. Jess Phillips' interview, by the way, she is getting death threats. That's certainly true. I know a lot of MPs who are getting death threats.
I don't want any MP to get a death threat.
Exactly.
I don't want Jess Phillips to get a death threat. I think, we need to be responsible in what we do. But what they're going through, even with death threats, and I personally have received death threats for things I've said on this programme, and I mean, it's not nice.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what the victims are going through is so much worse.
I completely agree. All I'm saying, I'm trying to explain where they are coming from when they're saying stuff like this. I do not think that there are MPs in the House who are seeing the massive fallout over this, whether that's from Elon, whether there is the thousands of emails they're getting from their constituents who are angry about this. I don't think they want to continue covering it up. to be honest. I really don't think so. I just think they're a bit lost where it comes from. And I think this idea that I'm not racist but, and adopting these definitions which are too broad, that's the real concern. So I think they need to sit down, have a real think about what they do next. Don't try and, I think the Tories and Reform with their amendments to the education bill that went through, that were eventually quashed, I think we need to be having larger debates in the House about this, much larger debates, and also in the press as well, which I'm glad the press is doing.
Yeah, we are having the debate anyway. Joe?
In the paper this morning, there's a huge number of people in Britain who want another inquiry. But you say the first one was quite good. What are we going to achieve with the second one? Should we not be focusing now on the victims, the sentences that were given, or sentences to be given out for those found guilty in the future?
A lot of people say this isn't about an inquiry. This is actually just about implementing the law and the police doing their job. And there's far too many times when, there have been investigations that have essentially regarded children as worthless and stupid little girls, when actually they weren't. They were telling the truth about what was happening to them.
Some of the accounts, 13-year-olds drunk a lot of alcohol with several men, and the police are saying that they gave consent, or they're just silly little drunkards.
Yeah.
How do we
you
stop
can't give
that?
consent if you're under 16. It's impossible. Yeah, it is rape, and it needs to be called what it is. And I do worry that we're, I don't want a mosque massacre like the one in New Zealand. Obviously, we've got to be responsible in how we're talking. But I'm not sure Wes Streeting. I mean, does he have a point? Do you think do you think that the national debate is inflammatory around this, or people are just calling out what's there, Maxwell? What's your sense? I mean, it's hard to talk about the hundreds of thousands, millions of words that have been discussed in this in the last 10 days, but my sense of it is, and what I get from our viewers and listeners who are always talking common sense, is that actually it's just exasperation.
I wouldn't call it exasperation, actually. I'd say it's the step worse than anger. It's disgust. And I think a disgusted nation is one which is will be using inflammatory language because they want to express themselves really clearly, and they're not feeling like their representatives are doing that. So I think there is a risk that we could be looking at very inflamed community tensions. I think it's down to those communities of which are accused to step up and, really call out what happened. Those communities discuss and anger with what happened and try and come together and try and form a way forward. And you're right, Peter, I'd like to see community leaders from these groups come out and suggest next steps.
Final word from Joe on this.
I think there just needs to be some kind of structure going forward. One, to look back at what happened, apologies, to be honest, for the victims, and some recognition of what they went through, because they have been ignored and swept under the carpet. And many of them, I've listened to them recently, are still suffering now, even though all this happened many, many years ago.
And some of it's ongoing now.
Absolutely. And the next thing is we make sure it never, ever happens again.
Yeah. Joe, Maxwell, thank you. We'll return to the debate desk in a second. Stay with us here on Talk.
UK. On DAB+. On your smart speaker. On your smart TV. And on your side. This is Talk.
Thank you to Steve Smedley, who has been in touch, who says Streeting is terrified of losing his seat and jumping on the far right line again. Disgraceful politicking as usual, and he'll still be booted out as the Muslim vote will only grow. This person's on, Lorraine says on Streeting telling us to stop talking about the Pakistani Muslim rape gangs because it may incite violence highlights the level these Labour politicians will stoop to, says this person, says Lorraine, in order to protect their own seats. The level of violence and depravity that these white children are suffering is beyond comprehension, and no longer should these innocents be sacrificed on the altar of political game playing. Streeting's attitude is deplorable, but not surprising considering some appalling posts he's made about other people in the past, including Jan Moyer, Chris Woodhead and Susan Hall. Well, I'm familiar with those posts and they are certainly controversial. Another person says if people in certain communities are fearful of reprisals because of the gang rape accusations, they should stamp this filthy, vile behaviour out themselves in those communities. Jackie says, I cannot believe what I'm hearing. There's a vast difference between sexual abuse and grooming gangs, which is organised rape, and torture gangs. Victims have realised they're being abused and the police have done nothing. Thank you to Mary, who says that this is how crime detection works. You look for patterns, you deploy covert, overt and intelligent gathering methods, you start targeting and profiling. Pakistani Muslim men abusing young white girls, stop cars with Pakistani men driving around with young white girls. If they're under 16, you suspect possible grooming, start an investigation, involve parents, involve social services. Police in many places shrank back from normal policing methods, particularly profiling and targeting, because bosses were running scared of racism claims. Jim Gamble, who we spoke to a little bit earlier, has been in touch because Joe Wheeler and Maxwell Marlowe are here on the debate desk today, and Jim has been watching what Joe has said and has been in touch with us to say, shocked to hear that Joe suggests that my point regarding some victims don't know they're victims because of the grooming and coercive control alongside tell that to the girls and their parents who went to the police. I, of course, addressed this and was clear that it was some victims. So we're happy to make that clear from Jim Gamble's perspective. Joe, just a final thought on this. What do we do now? How do we go forward with this? Or perhaps you want to react to what Jim says?
I would just say to Jim, I agree with him and also with the point that I made. Some people know that they're victims and they went to the police. There are others that were kind of absorbed into the group and chose to stay with them or chose to spend time with them. And those are the ones who were coerced, didn't really realise that it was wrong. Your listener who just said you pick up Pakistani men with white girls in the back, if they're underage, then you throw everything at it to make sure that it's not ongoing. It's simple and it's straightforward and it deals with the problem, surely? Yes, I
agree with every single word you've said. There will be people who say, racial profiling, is that a good idea? I don't care if it stops the problem. I really don't care. I mean, you know, there were people who look like me, sound like me, from my background, who were stopped at airports and told, where are you going, sir, over the years. I'm happy enough with that, if that stopped terrorism for 1 second in regard to Northern Ireland terrorism. Profiling, I'm very relaxed about it. Maxwell, a final word on this.
Well, the gangs were profiling, weren't they? So this is the amazing thing, is that, you know, we can't enforce the law because of wishy-washy concerns from police. I think this needs to be turned around immediately.
Okay, thank you very much. We're going to continue talking about this as the show goes on. You want to get your voice on the air? You give me a ring. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. There are a number of other stories around today that I want to talk about on the debate desk here with Maxwell and Joe, but we're not going to ignore this story. We are one of the few media outlets that have not ignored this story. We've talked about it consistently since the 1st of January. It's now the 11th of January. We'll talk about it till the 31st of December if you want us to. You let us know what you want us to talk about, because this is my show, but it's your show too. You want to talk about rape gangs? We'll talk about it till the cows come home, because something needs to be done. 0344 499 1000. Let's talk about the supply of gas that is in this country, because it has been cold recently. One person who knows all about that is Joe Wheeler. He's not just a political commentator, but a meteorologist as well, has been keeping us right up to date across this station in terms of what's happening. Why is there so little gas, and what is your thought on this in terms of how we keep people warm, Joe?
Well, first and foremost, I saw the headline this morning, you know, less than a week's gas. And obviously, everybody's concerned. The cold weather, it got down to, I think, minus 19.7 last night in Altnahara, which is pretty chilly by anybody's standards.
Where's that?
northern Scotland.
Right, okay, I thought so, yeah.
But right across the country, sub-zero, and places have got freezing fog, so temperatures won't rise above freezing during the day. And suddenly, there's a threat of only having 7 days' worth of gas, and it's like, oh no, what are we going to do? And this is on top of the pensioners who can't afford to heat their homes. So I read this story, and basically it's Centrica who would like the government to invest £2 billion into their stores off the East Coast, which shut in 2017 when the government said it was too expensive, and now they want to reopen, or sorry, they are now reopened partially, but only at a fifth of capacity. So we need that investment. Obviously, the trend is towards net zero and using sustainable power, but since we don't have that and can't do that, and to take my word for it, things are calming down with the weather, so your wind turbines aren't going to be much good to you for the next 2 weeks or so. We need something else.
Are we going too quickly towards net zero, do you think, Jo?
Absolutely. Not least of all because I have no doubt that there are new technologies being developed which are more efficient.
Never buy the prototype. Go do a few versions in and get it sorted.
Of course. So I think there may be other solutions in the future to be green and sustainable. Would be absolutely wonderful, but it's just not possible at the moment.
I think Jo has a point, don't you, Maxwell, that I don't think there are too many people who are not happy to do their bit, recycle a little bit, you know, do what needs to be done, but net zero and what Ed Miliband wants to do and the fact that, you know, there's only a week of supply left, that is all part and parcel, really, of the fact that we're moving very, very quickly to something that is fundamental change economically, environmentally, in so many different ways. Is Miliband moving too quickly?
Way too quickly. We're familiar every year, every December, with the NHS is in crisis. We're going to have exactly the same thing with our energy supplies if things do not change too quickly. I mean, let's look at why this crisis is happening currently. Yes, there's a capacity problem from Centrica and our general infrastructure. But there's also, we have exported our energy sovereignty. So part of the reason why there's a shortage, it's very cold in Texas at the moment, where we import a lot of our liquid natural gas. The fires in California, where a lot of the refining goes on, that stops a lot of production. We've also just put sanctions on Russian energy companies, and yes, I'm completely in favour of that, but there's a general supply of gas, which that is going to hold up. We're also competing with the Chinese and the Indians for that gas because they can't produce it on themselves. So we're just kind of this little player in the corner who've chosen to not do any fracking, even though we've got one of the most abundant supplies of shale in Europe, and also decided to stop issuing new oil and gas licences in the North Sea. So we are choosing completely consciously to cause this crisis continually. So we need to drill, baby, drill, to quote Donald Trump, get those fracking stations open across the Midlands and the north of England, and also to invest more in our North Sea oil.
Jo, final word on this?
Quite simply, basically what
he said.
It's what he said. Sorry, he did say he was going to ask me about the cold over central parts of America.
What is going on with that, Jo?
Yeah, well, that was a bit of a polar spill. So there's a vortex which keeps all the polar air in the far north, and it spilled down into those central parts of America. So
there we go.
That's where the cold came from. But I mean, we do need we need to create our own fuel. We need to have our own resources. How come China is opening power stations, coal-fired power stations?
All the time, and getting ahead of us economically.
Yeah,
Rachel Reeves is there at the moment.
And we're trying to buy it in.
Yeah.
It's just stupid. We have these resources, we have these facilities, we're just not using them.
Jo and Maxwell will be back in a second. Let me just read a couple of messages here. Leslie has been in touch and said, is Wes Streeting advocating shutting down the debate on grooming? That's how these girls were let down by the likes of Streeting, not wanting to face facts. Also, one of the long-standing issues in our society, says Dawn in Chelmsford, is that police, social services, education, probation, etc. always talk about interagency working. The reality is that they work in silos and victims fall through the gaps. Dawn, I have seen in government, when I worked in government for 3.5 years, how often different bits of government, different bits of the state don't work together. They have their own agendas. They often don't do that in lots of different ways, not just in that particular area. Also, Benny in Belfast has been in touch, has a bit of a policing bent with this one. Such investigations into grooming gangs were too hard for police. They took up too many resources, and the institutional misogyny of the police meant these children were regarded as worthless. Councils also shied away from robust social services action because their fear of being accused of racism. Resources also stretched. We have gross institutional failure laziness and complicity on a grand scale. They're predominantly white police officers, detectives and social workers who have no inroads into these Muslim communities, who do not engage with them. Hello, immigration, we reap what we sow. Lots in that, lots more to debate between now and 12 o'clock. 0344 499 1000. We'll be back in the debate desk with Maxwell and Joe in just a minute here on Talk.
I didn't actually create it. My officers created it and the engineers created it.
Right.
And obviously the idea comes from overseas, Holland, where you know there's a culture of walking and cycling. And in England and locally, we need to actually make sure we handle growth sustainably. There's lots of houses being built in the country. 11,000 in Hemel Hempstead planned in the next 5 or so years, 5,000 jobs. And if we rely on the car for everyone to get there, Hemel Hempstead will be an absolute gridlock.
We need to get tough on deporting people who come to our country and then break the law. We need to get really tough like other sensible countries do. And if the law doesn't allow us to do that, then let's change the law. And if international laws don't allow us to do that, then let's derogate.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, there's trouble at mill for Reform UK because 12 Reform UK councillors have announced they're going to resign in protest against Nigel Farage. They've branded the party leader of Reform UK disloyal and autocratic. The resignations could add to pressure on him. Of course, we've had Elon Musk saying that Nigel Farage isn't up to the job. He says that Rupert Lowe, who's one of the MPs for Reform UK, should take over. There are certainly problems for Nigel Farage in a number of directions, but in other directions you can say, well, yeah, he's got over 150,000 members of Reform UK, he's got 5 MPs, and in the local elections things are looking good for them, certainly in terms of the polls. There is one poll recently that put Reform as the most popular political party in this country. The councillors that are involved with this say they'll jump ship. They hold 2 district council seats, 9 town council seats and 5 parish council seats. All are from Derbyshire and include a guy called Alex Stevenson. He came second in Amber Valley, beautiful part of the world in Derbyshire, actually, Amber Valley. During the general election, he got 28% of the vote. They said they could not continue in good conscience under Nigel Farage's leadership. On the debate desk, Maxwell Marlowe and Joe Wheeler are still with me. Maxwell, what do you make of this?
Let's look into some of these councillors who are looking to resign. I have spoken to the Reform team. I've asked them, what is going on here? This seems very concerning.
You've done some research.
I've done some research. I know.
It's not just an opinion off the top of your head.
Definitely not.
What?
Unfortunately not. No. I've looked into it. So Reform tell me that some of these councillors are suspended because they were forging DNO certificates. Allegedly forging DNO certificates. And after the last election, where we saw a real crisis for Reform, where some of their candidates weren't as well vetted as they would have liked, they've tried to step it up. So Reform have told me that some of these guys are allegedly forging certificates, and they'll probably be suspended.
What are DNO certificates?
So they essentially like background checks, right? So if some councillors or candidates have failed the background check, allegedly, some of the gentlemen were forging the certificates to say yes, they can go forward. Okay. So that's what Reform has said.
Any time you see anybody resigning from a political job, there's always something else. No, these are just allegations. We're not saying anybody's done anything.
Exactly.
We're simply saying that there's always more to it, isn't there, Joe?
Agreed. I'm glad that Maxwell did the research. That's helped both of us out this morning, because I looked at this and I thought this has the feeling of an ambush to it. I mean, Reform is a relatively new party. It's going great guns. Its membership has increased, hugely, and it's doing very well in the polls. Of course, Richard Tice stood aside for Nigel, and Nigel Farage is a magnificent personality as far as I'm concerned. Whether you like him or whether you loathe him, I don't think...
He communicates like very few others. He connects. He connects with people.
He does. And when this criticism came from Musk, again, I was quite shocked. Well, not just what are you doing in UK politics, but why are you having a pop at Nigel Farage?
He has a right to have an opinion, though, doesn't he?
Of course he does. I totally agree. It was just rather interesting. I mean, obviously, they've got a lot going on in the States at the moment, aren't they? Busy? Is there not the 20th coming up? Are there something going on that day?
It's interesting, just on a lot of our viewers and listeners are Reform UK supporters, and it's interesting that Ben Habib, the former joint deputy leader, they seem to be supporters of his. They said he was unceremoniously dumped. They say that Ben Habib truly represents the vision and values that drew us to Reform UK. I mean, whatever the truth of this, whatever the ins and outs, and there's always some sort of Byzantine kind of reasons for these things, the fact is that, factually, Nigel Farage is someone who annoys a lot of people. I mean, you look at his time in UKIP, you look at his time in the Brexit Party, quite a number of people resigned, left under his leadership. The evidence is there to suggest that historically he's not someone who can hold an organisation together. Could there be trouble ahead here, Joe?
I'm not sure whether there's trouble ahead. I mean, losing Ben Habib was awful, and I think I was listening to your programme the other day. Some lady called saying, I've been desperate to get hold of you, come back. And he said, I'm not entirely sure whether Central Office would like that. But, of course, Nigel Farage, he was out in the States with Donald Trump, with the successes there. And the fact that Habib has gone, and now 12 councillors have gone, does cause people to turn around and say, hang on a second, what's happening with Reform? As I say, very popular. Yeah. I think their politics supersede either Labour or Conservative at the moment, because the country is looking for something else. When we were talking about the gangs earlier, is Reform promising to do something about that? And if they did, will they deliver? Because nobody else has done. This has gone on for a long time. We've had no answers. We've talked about the energy crisis. It's all obfuscation and net zero and no real plans what to do when we are all sitting shivering in our houses. Can Reform deliver? If they can, will they? And
in a sense, actually, do these rows about a few councillors actually matter if Reform UK is, it's clearly going great guns in the polls? We'll see what happens in the local elections. A number of local authorities councils basically have to decide whether they're moving into a different model and whether certain elections will happen and so on. But there will be elections in May, and all the evidence we have, Maxwell, is that Reform will do very well.
Yeah, well, the elections that are going ahead, of course, have been cancelled. On the Ben Habib question, I think just to, think about this a little bit more in detail, is that Ben Habib didn't win his seat, and it's quite hard to have, a deputy leader who isn't sitting in the House alongside Rupert or Lee or James, I just think that's a little bit concerning, to be honest, because, yes, Ben, left and it wasn't under the best circumstances, but I can kind of see why he was kicked out, because he didn't win a seat, it's really hard to then come back in.
I can see why they perhaps removed him as deputy leader, but the way it seems to have been done, like we're getting into the weeds now of how things are. But, you know, speaking of excellent communicators, Ben Habib is one of those people who communicates really, really well, and I think there are very few actually who communicate as well as he does.
I think the Reform team are upset that it's gone the way it has. He, as your listeners know, as you know, he was very much loved and is very much loved, and that's why we keep going back to him. Ben. Okay. So you know, I think this is a bump in the road. I don't think it's going to stop them from achieving what is likely to be a large amount of success in the coming elections.
Well, we will see what happens with Reform UK. Thank you both very much indeed, Maxwell Marlowe and Joe Wheeler, political commentators both. Joe, of course, is a meteorologist as well, keeping us up to date with what's going on. Thank you to everybody who's been in touch, including Kelvin in Macclesfield, who says, "Morning, Peter. The government wants foreigners to stop interfering in our politics, but don't want foreigners to stop interfering with our children." Very, very interesting thought on that. Matt in Manchester says, "I'm sick of the smoke and mirrors about inquiries. I want police investigations and then immediate prosecutions," in the words of Matt. And Shane says, "I'm tired of politicians and the wider media and commentators using scare tactics such as streeting, saying all of this is going to incite violence to shut down debate rather than tackling the real issues," says Shane. Trudy says, "I don't think we need an inquiry into the acts of gangs, but it is essential we have an inquiry or something to understand the reasons it was ignored for so long, so those can be tackled and people feel safe coming forward in the future, and people in power feel empowered to tackle it when it is discovered." Rachel Reeves is talking in China. Laurie Laird has been watching it, so you don't have to. She'll give us her verdict in just a second here on Talk. Do stay with us.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good morning, this is Talk. Peter Cardwell here. I hope you've been with us for the last hour because we've had a really spirited discussion about all sorts of things, including those paedophile gangs, what we should do about them, and Reform UK as well. We talked about that. We talked about gas and why we don't have enough of it. We'll talk a little bit more about that as time goes on between now and 12 o'clock. I want to get some more calls on the air as well. Chris in London, we'll talk to him soon as well. And if you want to get your call on the air, give me a shout. 0344 499 1000. Loads of messages coming in as well. Get to those in a second. But plenty to talk about, including number 10, plotting billions in disability welfare cuts to ease the debt crisis. The Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, she's been in China, have said that in that way because Donald Trump, of course, says it that way. She has talked about not altering her economic plans. The October budget designed to return the UK to economic stability. Do you feel it's economically stable? I'm not so sure. She says the growth is the number one mission of this government. We'll talk to Laurie Laird, who's been watching that speech in China, so you don't have to. We'll talk to her in just a second. I want to get your voice on the air as well, as I say. 0344 499 1000. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text. You can tweet me at talkTV or follow me at Peter Cardwell. You can send me a voice note, you can send me a WhatsApp text message, or you can give me a ring 0344 499 1000. Stay with us here on Talk. Slightly shorter show today because of the football. We'll be here until 12 o'clock though, so another hour of discussion with me. Then it goes over to the sport on radio. There are lots of other shows, of course, on the telly, or if you're watching on a screen. Just to let you know, I'll be here with Drive on Thursday and Friday between 4 and 7, and the usual shows next weekend as well, so I hope you can join me for those. Thanks everybody who's been in touch, including this person who says, I can't believe you're having speakers that are yet again generalising on this group rape gangs in the north of England. Certain male cultures living in the UK have no respect for British white girls living here. This inquiry needs to start in the north, where these crimes have been reported, and then taken to other counties where necessary. Generalising will just push it under the carpet and no one will be held to account. Dave in Bristol says local inquiries are fairly toothless and, by the fact they are local, unlikely to get to the truth. A national inquiry would have the power to compel people to give evidence and not just refuse to attend. The truth about how this was allowed to happen and those involved arrested, punished and, wherever possible, deported. But it is also vital, if this is going to be stopped and never allowed to happen again, that those in authority and positions of power, no matter how senior, who prevented prosecutions, deflected the exposure of this atrocity and covered it up, are identified and, where appropriate, punished. If a national inquiry is not going to do it, then some form of national police investigation with power and teeth should take place. Dave, I agree with every single word of that, but why was this not happening previously? Why do we need more powers? The law is there. If you have sex with someone under 16, that is rape. And, you know, we should be able to sort this out. Jackie says, we need to scrap community leaders and speak to the community itself. I do wonder about some of these self-styled community leaders. Certainly where I come from in Northern Ireland, there's a few questions over that, but definitely community leaders. Sometimes they don't lead their community. Sometimes they tell their communities what to do, which is very different. Paul in Cornwall says, I think we know who the perpetrators were and their methods of operation. The inquiry I want to see is the people who had a duty of care and covered it up or ignored it. The police, the social workers, the politicians, they should face the consequences. I'll bet some of them are still in office. Just on, before we talk to Laurie Laird, a couple, just one actually on Reform UK. Just a thought, says Frank Etchells in Bingley in West Yorkshire. Do you think Nigel Farage could be engineering himself out as Reform leader and then moving across to the Tories to become leader? I have a feeling. Frank, I don't think so. I don't see that so far. Although, similar, as you say, you know, Nigel Farage, he hasn't ruled out becoming a leader of the Conservative Party. I think Nigel Farage will do what's best for Nigel Farage, whatever the circumstances are. But listen, agree with me, disagree with me, whatever your thoughts are, 0344 499 1000. Let's talk about another politician now, Rachel Reeves. She's been in China saying growth is the number one mission of this government. The fiscal rules laid out in the budget are non-negotiable. Economic stability is the bedrock for economic growth and prosperity. The Treasury added that the Chancellor, I should say, added that making Britain better off will be at the forefront of her mind during her visit. Well, Laurie Laird is with me now. She's an economist and breaks all these things down so people with my simple mind can understand it. Laurie, you've been watching Rachel Reeves, so we don't have to. Has she been saying anything new?
Yes, and you're welcome for that, Peter. No, she hasn't said anything new at all. And I think part of the problem, of digressing a tiny bit before I've even started, is Rachel Reeves is now in a position where she has to deliver some pretty difficult news and hasn't found the right tone in which to do this. And it's unfortunate that we live in an era where politicians speak to cameras, but it is part of the job. And what we heard from Rachel Reeves in China was that sort of the half-baked things that we always have. We want to cooperate more with China. Growth. We're going to create growth. We all talk about growth, but it's not entirely clear that Rachel Reeves or anyone else entirely understands what that means. Now, she knew that she had to talk about the fact that she went to China during this period that interest rates, government borrowing rates, ran up in a hurry. I don't think she should have stayed behind. I do not think that the economy is in any sort of a crisis. Staying back would have, kind of pointed to a sense of panic. But she does need to address this situation, and all that she said is that she's not going to provide a running commentary on what's happening in financial markets. I think that she can do better than that, because it appears that she's sort of brushing people's concerns under the carpet.
I think that's right, and certainly in regard to the markets. I mean, we had her deputy, Darren Jones, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, saying the other day that the markets are working as they're meant to. The cost of government debt has gone up. That's bad news for consumers, because it all does matter. In terms of China itself, I mean, their own economy isn't doing brilliantly, is it?
Thank you for pointing this out. This is a really big point, and we're seeing a lot of coverage about, perhaps what could come of better cooperation between the UK and China. But you have to remember, a lot of Chinese industry, the sort of industry that would invest outside of Chinese borders, is either linked to the state, either indirectly or directly. The Chinese state doesn't have a whole lot of extra money right now. It's also very concerned about money leaving China, because that will put pressure on the Chinese currency. China has said that it wants to. The Chinese economy is slowing. It's in its weakest state in years. No doubt about that. The government has finally acknowledged that, and they have said that what they want to do is try and spur consumption, get Chinese people to start spending more. Chinese are not feeling particularly confident, a little lack of confidence in their economic leadership there as well as here. But the Chinese government is looking at stimulating its economy and spending money domestically. So there isn't a great sense of, economic adventurism in China at the moment.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because we sort of think of China, or a lot of people have thought of China, as a sort of panacea. They'll get the growth, they'll get the investment. Obviously, that's without even considering the human rights problems, the many issues of spying as well. Look, they spy on us, we spy on them. I'm sure that's the case. But certainly, this is not just a catch-all. And I mean, I imagine, I suppose, I don't know what your thoughts are, but some people are certainly happy that these discussions about investment have continued, or have started up again after about 5 years when they haven't happened. Other people say, hold on a second, China created, in many people's view, the COVID in a lab, so there's plenty of evidence for that, so they should be paying us reparations. I mean, we have a very complicated relationship with China, and actually the Chinese themselves, I think, could be forgiven for being a bit confused about what our relationship with them is, because it's changed so many times in terms of British politicians over the last while. I mean, you even look at someone like Liz Truss, for example, who has changed her mind almost completely on China in the last 10 years.
Yeah, and Rachel Reeves made sure to use the word pragmatic more than once. We want a pragmatic relationship with China. Very interesting, because she didn't say a whole lot in her speech, but her equivalent number, the vice premier, talked at length and talked about a lot of the areas for cooperation. He talked about working with the UK on the World Trade Organization, on bilateral lending, on the Asian Investment Bank. It's hilarious. These are not organizations that China particularly participates in. China is not a multilateralist, and to hear the Chinese saying this is how we want to work with Britain, and Britain not saying much about it at all, where Britain has tended to be across the world a leader in globalization, a leader in free trade. It seemed really odd to have those positions reversed. But I think the main thing that I'm seeing from Rachel Reeves this week is that things look disjointed. It doesn't feel like she has a grasp. Talks about growth. It doesn't feel like she has a sense of how to achieve that. And it's very frustrating because this party's been in opposition for 14 years. Rachel Reeves has some financial experience. She once worked for the Bank of England. Yet it feels like we're still pedaling. There's still lots of U-turns. There doesn't seem to be a grown-up plan for how to get the economy on some sort of track. And that's sort of unforgivable after all this time in opposition. I feel the same way when I hear Wes Streeting say, let's consult people on how to make the NHS better. And that's
it's like, why don't you know?
A couple of years.
Yeah, why don't you know?
Where have you been? What have you been doing?
Well, exactly. Also, Rachel Reeves saying in the regulators, asking the regulators how to get economic growth. That's not really their job. And also, if you work for a regulator, you're probably not going to be a great mind in terms of growth. It's a very, very weird thing. Laurie, let me ask you about
I'm so glad you brought the regulator up, and I'm sorry to repeat what you just said because I think this is being so underreported. And in fact, the top securities regulator is on this trip to China. You don't want your regulator to encourage growth. The regulator's there to take away the punch bowl, right? When things get,
yes.
They're not there to spike the drain.
It's very strange. It's very strange. Let's talk about another politician, also someone who is very interested in China, and indeed thank you to Brad in Cambridge who says I have to smile every time you say China in the style of Trump. We do that.
I did the same.
We do that in this house as well. That's really the only word I can do in a Trump voice. There's only
glad to hear it.
There's only two words I can do in Starmer, which is the Metropolitan Police. That's the way he talks. He always says Metropolitan Police that way.
I bet you can say toolmaker. Yeah.
he certainly can. He's mentioned it enough, Laurie. In 9 days' time, Donald Trump is going to be president again, president of the United States for a second time. The economic picture for America is going to change dramatically. How do you predict it's going to change for the United Kingdom in relation to the United States, Laurie?
I mean, this is a really tricky one because everything that Trump has proposed, specifically these tariffs that he indiscriminately wants to put on people of countries that displease him, this has to be inflationary. And there are no examples in our history where that hasn't been inflationary. Tariffs mean that people who import goods pay a higher price. They tend to pass that on to consumers. Add to that his promise of deporting undocumented workers, which could be as many as 1 in 6 in the U.S. population. There's already a bit of a labor shortage in the U.S. So this will push up. If you can get rid of these people, I think Trump is a little bit optimistic on how many he could forcibly remove. Okay. But it will push up labor costs. That will also add to inflation. Now, stick with me, and I know you get glazed over when I talk about bond yields a little bit, government borrowing rates.
I just feel guilty.
Peter, I've been working with you on this.
Yes.
But any sort of inflation in the U.S. means that people who lend to the U.S., they buy these things called bonds. These bonds have an interest rate on them. But if you foresee inflation, you want a higher interest rate because inflation is going to eat up some of your return. This is likely to happen in the U.S. And in fact, after we had a strong jobs report in the U.S. yesterday, bond yields soared in the U.S. The U.S. sort of sets the tone when it comes to this government borrowing sort of markets. So the U.K. does follow the U.S. So if we see greater inflation in the U.S., we're likely to see bond yields in the U.S., that's government borrowing rates in the U.K., follow what's happening in the U.S. So even though Donald Trump's policies seem to be domestically oriented, the U.S. being the biggest economy in the world, its policies reverberate.
Thank you, Laurie. You cut through the noise and just make it so clear. Really appreciate that. That's Laurie Laird, who's an economist and political commentator. I appreciate her joining us today. Jane says, how can this government talk about the security of this country when they cannot protect our own borders? Leslie says, how does increasing taxes for the private sector increase growth? And John Roberts in Germany says, no new laws, no new ministers, no more two-tier policing. We need a robust, speedy inquiry into who didn't carry out the law of this land. Punish those who didn't do their job, prison for those who are and did cover it up, and finally prison and deportation were applicable to the perpetrators of this crime. Chris gave me a ring yesterday on Drive. We didn't have all the time in the world because I think we're beaten by the news. Chris, you're very welcome back to the programme today. Thanks for giving me another ring. Do you want to continue on your points that you were making on those rape gangs? Tell us your thoughts.
Morning, Peter.
Morning.
Nice not to be up against the end of the show.
Yeah, no worries. Go ahead.
Well, in fact, your female guest earlier made some very good points.
Jo Wheeler, she's great.
Jo Wheeler, sorry, I forgot her name.
That's all right.
And also, you read out I think it was another woman that messaged you in what should be done in stopping cars with Pakistani-looking men, and saying about grooming it.
That was Mary in County Down. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
she was absolutely spot on with what needs to happen. And Jim Gamble,
yeah.
Yeah. He made some very interesting points about. I'm getting echo back from you now. Made some very interesting points about the destruction of the Child Protection Online agency. I think there should be a new agency created, a Child Protection Force.
Yeah.
All right, that brings together social services and local councils and every other institution or that has a role in looking after children. But the bigger, and this is going to be very difficult conversation that needs to be had, all right, and it's not been had yet. And I'll tell you where I'm coming from. My girlfriend is Muslim, and she's a European Muslim. We've been together 8 years. I talked to her mother, but her father and her brother can't know about this because there's a danger of an honour killing. So,
wow. Okay. Yeah. I'm sorry to hear that she's in that situation, and you as well. That cannot be fun.
No, it's not fun, but we're 8 years into it now. So, we found ways.
Yeah.
The thing is that you're not quite correct in saying, you keep saying Pakistani Muslim rape gangs.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is not just Pakistani. All right? In this country alone, we've had Pakistani, Somalian, Bangladeshi, and Turkish. And if you look around the rest of Europe, it's the same as well.
Okay.
And they all have one thing in common. They are all Muslims. And the Quran states that they can take the 4 women, which is our white women, and they are not valuable. They can do what they like, but they take them as sex slaves. This is preached in the Quran. This is why you don't get any imams coming out and stating their horror of what's going on in their communities.
There have been some Muslim leaders who've said that, but they're not nearly enough.
No, Peter, it's been a whisper.
Okay.
This needs to be discussed. We have,
absolutely.
We have in the Bible, in Deuteronomy, in the Old Text, we have just as many horrible things written. But we have evolved. We have evolved as Christians. This was a Christian country based on Christian rules that's moved to a democracy and a balanced social, economic powerhouse.
Yeah.
Which has now invited in people that have come from countries that are following their text that was written in the 8th century and believe that text should be followed. The Quran itself states that all Muslim men should emulate their prophet Muhammad, who married Aisha at 6 and consummated the marriage at 9. Now, Iraq, for instance, has just lowered the legal age of consent for females to 9. This is.
And these are not our values. These are not British values. This is not British law. And to me, this is a cultural issue. There's no doubt about that, Chris, and you know that far better than I do because of your personal circumstances. And there just I just think, people can say, and I agree with you, I totally agree with you in regard to the authorities and what they should do, and they should just do their job. I don't know what the mechanism is. I think there's a debate to be had about that, and we're having that debate. But fundamentally, it comes down to people saying, this is wrong. This shouldn't happen. We can't turn a blind eye to it. We've got to enforce the law properly. The police have got to be trusted and supported by everybody in order to do that, although there are many problems with trust in the police and many institutions because they've failed so dramatically on this. And there are But fundamentally, it just comes down to saying these are not British values. This is not legal. This should never, ever happen, and everybody needs to be completely clear about that. And my worry, Chris, is that they're not.
Yeah, you're right, Peter. You're right. The conversation needs to be had, and the enforcement needs to be made of our British rules, and the police need to operate without worry of politicians breathing down their neck with PC madness. Now, yeah, that's got to happen. Oh, by the way, don't cut me off at the end because I've got something to tell you about.
all right. Couple more minutes and then we've got to go to a break, Chris. But yeah, go ahead.
It's a conversation that's got to be had. We've got to explain to people and make it clear that if you come to the UK, we have rules and laws that you have to obey.
Yeah.
All right?
All right. Chris, I'm going to have to move you to your final point because producer's shouting at me, telling me I've got to go to a break. It's all good. Okay, we'll go to a break in a second. But what's your final point?
Final point on power at the moment and the lack of gas that we have. I just did some mathematics while I was watching you this morning. And a nuclear-powered submarine, all right, which we know the power units in them are safe. They've been safe for God knows how many years. Just one of them could power 69,000 homes.
Yeah, well, listen, it's a big issue, and we're actually going to get into that next, Chris. So keep listening. You've certainly had your say again this morning, and I appreciate you giving me a ring back. That's Chris in London there. Thank you. We're going to talk to Gwithian Prince, who's a research professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science, about this exact issue. So stay with us here on Talk.
Changing the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. What a beautiful name. The Panama Canal is vital to our country. It's being operated by China. China. You get rid of that artificially drawn line, Canada and the United States, that would really be something. All hell will break out in the Middle East, and it will not be good for Hamas, and it will not be good, frankly, for anyone.
Across the UK, on DAB+, On your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
British Gas have warned that there's only a week of gas left. Now, I think things are a little bit better than they have been since that announcement. That is Centrica, which is the company that owns British Gas. Gwythian Prince is with me now, research professor at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Gwythian, it's far too long since we had you on to talk about anything. We should just have you on every week, basically. Gwythian, what do you make of this?
Well, good morning. It's a very good day to be talking about this, Peter, because people watching probably aren't aware that at 5:30 on Wednesday, just 2 days ago, we had our closest to having a complete blackout on the British electricity grid that we've had since 2011. There was just 580 megawatts, which is about the size of one small power station, between the peak demand at 5:30, which was 47.405 gigawatts, and the peak demand, which was 46.825. So we have a real system problem. But to answer your question, I think it comes in two parts, and we ought to deal with them separately, Peter. The first is about raw energy availability, and that's the question you just asked me. And that is principally about gas. And it's about gas because of the massive contortion of our electricity grid that has been produced by the application of the, in my opinion, frankly, crazy pursuit of so-called net zero carbon, which forces the use of uncontrollable, unreliable, low-quality wind and solar when it's available, but for which you always have to have reliable, deliverable fossil fuels running in the background. And that means at the moment now gas, because we go around blowing up our coal-fired power stations. So compare our situation now with people on the continent. The Dutch have about 120 days of gas in reserve. We have, as you just said, about a week. The rough storage, gas storage under the North Sea is about half full. So what it means is, in security terms, and as you know, I'm principally a security boffin, it means that we are dependent on a carousel of LNG or LPG, LNG tankers coming from Qatar, which is a fairly unstable part of the world, or from the United States, which is not an unstable part of the world. And if we
Qatar, sorry to interrupt you, Gwythian, but Qatar is not a part of the world that I want to rely on for my energy security. Thank you very much.
Well, that would be a perfectly reasonable security judgment to make. But there's another reason why you don't want to rely on a carousel of ships, which is that the Chinese, for example, can buy a cargo while it's on the high seas, and the ship turns around and it goes off to Shanghai. These sorts of things happen. The only other way that we get our gas in large quantity now is through a gas pipeline from Norway. And as we know, we're in grey warfare with Russia and with China. And so if somebody accidentally on purpose drags a cable or drops some explosives and blows up a gas pipeline or interferes with it, such as our Norwegian gas pipeline, we're really stuffed. Because the other thing that mad Mr. Miliband, and I use the term advisedly, has done is to take steps along with his inept friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel from Complaints, to make the North Sea uninvestable. So it means that we're not going to go forward with our own domestic supplies of oil and gas that we could extract. And what we already have is going to be run down. So we find ourselves critically dependent on imports, and this is completely crazy. Now, the other side of the equation is what happened on Wednesday night. As I pointed out, we were within a whisker. But of course, the government will pay any price to keep the lights on. And indeed we do. Because we have this crazy drive to put renewables onto the grid, we are paying, on average, every day, 2.3 million in so-called balancing charges. This means every time that you've got a wind farm or a solar farm putting electricity onto the grid, you have to have a standby reliable power station in the background, which means gas. And That on Wednesday, because it's a dunkelflaut, meaning no wind, no sun, this meant that the government paid, and the figures are not yet official, but I've seen reliable estimates, we paid 10 times the average. £21 million was paid in extra charges to gas-fired power stations to keep them running. Some of them were charging up to £5,500 per megawatt hour to generate on Wednesday evening, compared to the normal, which is 50 to 100. Now, this is no way to run a corner sweet shop.
I mean, you've painted a pretty scary picture there, Gwithian, actually, of what is actually going on. And thank you very much for doing so. That's Gwithian Prinz there, who is a professor at an academic at the LSE, research professor, apologies, at the LSE, the London School of Economics and Political Science. Really, really interesting what he's saying there. And it's really illuminated the issue, as Gwithian often does. So thank you for his contribution. In a minute, we're going to talk to someone called Roger Scarborough. Roger is a former detective sergeant at Lancashire Constabulary. He was a whistleblower on a lot of the grooming gangs, rape gangs, paedophile gangs issues. And we're going to get his story. It's going to be a fascinating listen, I have no doubt. Stay with us here on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, we're going to talk now to a former detective sergeant from Lancashire Constabulary. His name is Roger Scarborough. Roger, thank you very much for joining me this morning. And I know you've been following this issue in regard to rape gangs, grooming gangs, the debate that's been going on the last few days, but you also have personal experience of attempting valiantly actually to do something about this, but there were many obstacles in your way. Perhaps you can just tell us what happened and when you were operating as a detective sergeant. I know you retired in 2005, but just tell us your experience.
Yeah, that's correct. I retired in 2005. We were on a burglary exercise in East Lancashire. East Lancashire, use a term for Nelson, Blackburn, Burnley area. We'd been sent over there from the Fylde Coast, which is the Blackpool area, to try and detect an increase in burglaries. So we were driving around in plain cars. We were unfamiliar with the area. We didn't know any of the local criminals, but that's basically what we were trying to find. Anybody about to commit burglaries. However, as we're driving round, I noticed that one of the taxi offices, where the taxis were parked outside, predominantly Asian drivers, there were a number of young girls. And we're talking now 1990, 91.
Okay. How old were the girls? You're talking about children here.
I'm talking specifically about children in my estimation. 12 to 15 years, I would put it at. I would describe them as fairly average sort of girls. They did look slightly neglected, I must admit. But what seemed unhealthy was that these young girls were laughing and joking with mature male Asian drivers. And there were several of these girls, and we're talking at a time when grooming gangs were not heard of.
Yeah.
It was something...
But that's what it was. You were seeing that.
I was seeing that, but I was unaware of it. As I said, I use that term unhealthy because I was very, very unhappy about what I was seeing.
So what did you do about it, Roger? Tell us about what you did about it.
Well, I was liaising with a local officer, and I asked him, I said, what are these young kids doing hanging about with men? And he said, we know all about this. He said, they're out of control. He said, some of them are on drugs, and they've got problems with alcohol. Well, it just didn't sit well with me at all. However, my main concern was these burglaries.
Yeah. That's what you were there to investigate. But you'd raised this with the local officers, and they were saying, well, we know about this, but clearly they weren't doing enough about it.
It's certainly not in my estimation, and I'll put it this way. Knowing what I know now about grooming gangs, if I were to walk down my local main road and see the same set of circumstances, and I'm over 70 now, I would do something about it, and I would certainly be contacting the police. But unfortunately, as I said, to repeat myself, we were talking about a time where perhaps but it was so abhorrent what has gone on in East Lancashire that you didn't even consider that. And I accepted to a great extent what the local officer said, that they were out of control.
Did you raise it with more senior officers? What did you leave it at that, or did you raise it again?
I did mention it on several occasions. However, I was only there for a couple of weeks. And I was under pressure because we had a team of detectives concentrating on the burglary.
So you could see this. You were essentially a visiting police officer to this area, looking at the burglaries, dealing with a specific task. You were raising this. You were talking to senior officers. I mean, what do you think the attitude of the senior officers of the Lancashire Constabulary were at that time, and later as well? I know you retired in 2005. Were they worried about the impact this could have had on race relations? Were they worried about, were those factors clouding out their judgment in terms of actually dealing with crime?
I think 100% you've hit the nail on the head, because everything was to keep race relations on a level playing field. There was nothing done to upset race relations.
And do you think that particular issue was clouding their judgment? They were turning a blind eye to crime?
With hindsight, without doubt.
I mean, that's just appalling, isn't it?
It was certainly, and it's worried me ever since, because we're now talking about 30 years plus, and it's concerned me ever since.
Yeah. What do you think should happen now in regard to what the police did or didn't do? Not just Lancashire Constabulary, and we haven't heard from them on this, but Roger, your story is a compelling one. In regard to individual police forces, in regard to what the authorities did, what do you think the way forward is to get back to that time, to think about what happened in the early 90s and beyond, and indeed what is happening right now?
Well, I'd like to think that officers with experiences like mine, and in particular the officers who were local to that area when I visited, for them to come forward and tell the story, because they have far more than I can tell you to say.
Yeah. Roger, it's been fascinating talking about this particular issue. I just wonder about the leadership here as well. What you thought about your leaders in that constabulary when they were essentially saying to you, it's all a bit difficult, pipe down.
I was disgusted. And have been disgusted ever since.
Yeah.
And it's cast a shadow over my service.
Roger, thank you for sharing your story with us. I really appreciate that. That's Roger Scarborough there. He's a former detective sergeant at Lancashire Constabulary. He was a whistleblower, and he wasn't listened to. And that just... Unfortunately, there's so many stories that we won't hear. Thank you for Roger for speaking to us today. I really appreciate that he's done that. But there are just too many times when people did raise the alarm and they were ignored. It is horrendous. We're going to talk more about this. We'll talk more about this tomorrow. We'll talk about this as long as you want to talk about it. I'm on between 10 and 12:30 tomorrow. We hope to speak to the government. We hope to speak to the opposition as well. Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, should hopefully be joining us tomorrow. And we'll continue talking about grooming gangs, about paedophilia, about the problems in our society. And you can let me know your thoughts on 0344 499 1000. In just a second, we'll talk about Donald Trump as well. He is going to be the president again in 9 days' time. His inauguration is happening on Monday week. What are the implications for America and for this country as well? And of course, coming out of the back of the fact that he yesterday got an unconditional discharge for all the crimes for which he has been convicted. It's a fascinating political time there. It's a fascinating political time here as well. Stay with us here on Talk.
Apart from the Western world, we've had our time. That is the message. So surely, then, Elon Musk is evil. to point out that, oh, well, the Western world kind of did good things. And maybe we need to look at how we can protect it and celebrate it and make sure it can go on being the bastions of progress in the world. Because, frankly, without Western civilization, we'd be in pretty dark ages. And yet, Western civilization is attacking itself.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Thank you to everybody on Twitter who's been in touch, including Chris, who says, shouldn't West Streeting be more worried about the fact Pakistani people do not want to speak out and tell the truth about these gangs? Sandy says, morning Peter, let's see the true story, why the councillors have resigned from Reform UK. Actually, it's because one of them was suspended. Others have gone off on a huff. The membership of Reform UK is nearly 180,000, not 150,000 as you state. Just for balance, I'm fed up with people listening to people smearing Farage. I'm not smearing Farage, Sandy. I'm simply telling you what is happening. These people are going. And there is a row, an internal row, clearly, within Reform UK. But yeah, as you say, they're going great guns. And as I pointed out earlier, they are, they're topping polls. There is a poll recently saying that Reform UK is the most popular political party in this country. Thanks to Susan as well, who says, talking about Ben Habib, the former deputy leader, frequent commentator in this station, of course. Susan says Ben Habib has lost a lot of support. I've seen quite a lot of negative posts about him. Nigel is right to have a clear out. He's trying to build a credible electable party, says Susan. So thank you to for all of those messages, including Mick, who says Starmer, Reeves and Miliband have spitefully destroyed our economy for an ideology. What is the penalty? Nothing. If they'd robbed a bank, they would be in jail. But a country, nothing. Terry and Slough says, I'm 75. We shouldn't have any trouble keeping warm in this country with all the hot air sprouting from this utterly useless and incompetent Labour government. Says Terry. Julia is in Tilbury. Is giving me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Julia, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Good morning. Well,
Morning.
Apparently the Bibby Stockholm, the contract the government had with the Bibby Stockholm expires today.
Right.
I do know that they hired that to put illegal migrants in because it was cheaper than keeping them in a hotel.
That's right, Julia, yeah.
But I don't know how many people were in that Bibby Stockholm. But
They had capacity, I think they had a capacity for about 500, but I don't think it ever reached capacity.
No, I know. There wasn't hardly any people in there most of the time. What I'm annoyed at the government about is, in the middle of winter, not once did they attempt to put any of our homeless people who are living on the streets in the middle of winter in tents or in a sleeping bag. They could have put some of our homeless people in that Bibby Stockholm.
It's a very good point.
They was paying for it all that time.
It was there.
And it just sat there practically empty. And we've got people, not just born in Britain, but majority born in Britain, living on the streets in sleeping bags and tents. And not once did either of our governments attempt to put any of them in there. And I think that is disgusting.
I think it's a very, very good point there, Julia, and thanks for your thoughts. There are, the homelessness crisis, I used to work on it in government, and it's a very, very big issue, and there's no one solution to it. But Julia, that is a solution, I think, and thank you very much for your call, 0344 499 1000. I appreciate you getting in touch. Matthew Bryza is with us now. He's a former White House and senior State Department official, essentially the Foreign Office of America, the State Department in the Obama administration. Matthew, we're going from a Democratic administration to a Republican administration in 9 days' time. It hasn't exactly been a quiet transition period for Donald Trump, not least in the last 48 hours or so. What do you make of the fact that he has been given an unconditional discharge from the crimes of which he's been convicted in New York? A lot of people saying there's some element of the judicial system here. Maybe there's even justice, but there's certainly a political element to this.
Yeah, it did start out quiet, this transition, and I've been involved in others. I mean, I served for 4 years in George W. Bush's White House, and there was some storminess in the transition from Clinton to Bush. But this
is that thing about the keyboards true?
Yeah, exactly. It's true. It's true.
The story about the keyboards on the W on the keyboards, because the rumor was that the people from the Clinton administration on their keyboards, their computer keyboards, took off the W of the keyboards, and I wondered, is that an urban myth or is that actually true?
No, it's true. It's true.
It's a bit petty. Bit petty.
It is quite petty. It's quite petty. But in this case, I don't know. Personally, I think that the outcome is actually a pretty good one, in that Trump was convicted by a jury of his peers. Right? These weren't political people. They convicted him. But to issue a fine, or for God's sake, a prison term to a president that was just reelected, despite the public knowing about the conviction, that also would have struck me as over politicizing the outcome. So in this case, yes, you're right. Politics did play a role in the decision, but it was impossible either way to avoid politics. Either way, there would either be a sentencing or a fine given to a president just chosen by the American voters, or there wouldn't be because of politics.
What do you make of what Donald Trump has been saying in this transition period? We've seen quite a number of big noises, big people, Sebastian Gorka, for example, in the last few days, suggesting that the UK should take back various radicalized Islamists from Syria. So he said that would help the special relationship and clear up some of the mess in Syria. We've had, of course, Elon Musk, over 200 tweets about UK politics since the start of the year. Might even have reached 300 by now. They certainly seem to be coming out at a rate of knots. There are some, as well as Donald Trump, who is undeniably a big personality, there are many other people making their voices heard even before they're back in the White House.
And even when they're not elected. I mean, Sebastian Gorka is not elected, and Elon Musk has never run for any political office either. It's unprecedented in my lifetime that officials, soon-to-be officials in the White House, or people very close to the President of the United States, would involve themselves in the politics of other countries. And I think it was the head of the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union Party in Germany, who said, yes, German democracy is under assault by Russia, by China, and by the United States in the form of Elon Musk. Unprecedented. Not to mention the outlandish statements by President Trump about, the U.S. maybe taking Greenland or the Panama Canal by force and annexing Canada as the 51st state.
Yeah, I'm not sure about those lines about Greenland. That was that was all a bit strange, wasn't it? And I mean, that press conference certainly was fascinating. But what we saw, I think, and you're the expert, Matthew, but what I think we saw in the first Trump administration was a bit of a gulf sometimes between what Donald Trump said he would do versus what he actually did. He's undeniably more prepared this time. His people are more prepared. Are they kind of ready to go from day one? And what do you think their first actions will be?
Yeah, you're right. There was a gulf between what he threatened to do, like, to strike Iran, and then Iran hit the Saudi oil processing facility, and Trump did not respond. Are they ready to go? Well, based on the accounts of, let's say, the White House designated Chief of Staff Susie Wiles and people, I was in Washington last week talking to members of the new team. The senior people are getting ready, yeah. But Trump himself is so unpredictable that, what are they getting ready for? I mean, they've got their concepts of what the policy should be, but they're subject to change.
What do you make of Susie Wiles as new Chief of Staff? Because, I mean, that is an absolutely crucial, incredibly powerful role. Will she be a moderating force? Will she be someone who is perhaps less moderate? Will she be someone who says, no, President, you can't do this? Or will she simply say, right, that's what you tell us to do, let's get on and do it?
I think it's more the latter. I mean, that was the way she behaved during the election campaign. By all accounts, I wasn't there. She's known as being a really nice person, a really effective manager, somebody who doesn't seek the limelight, and somebody, who enables her boss. I mean, that's the dream chief of staff. So as you said a moment ago, Peter, I mean, Trump is much better prepared this time because the last time I don't think he expected to win. This time he expected to win, and he's been preparing now all these years to come back and prove to the world that he's not a loser.
Absolutely fascinating. Thank you very much indeed. That's Matthew Bryza there, former White House and senior State Department official, served in a number of administrations, including the Obama administration. Thank you for that. It'll be fascinating. We'll have full coverage, of course, of Trump's inauguration here on Talk. We'll get all the best opinions, the best foresight in terms of what will happen. That is in 9 days' time on Monday, the 20th of January. People in the United States, people here in the UK will be glued to it, no doubt. Alison says Roger Scarborough is 100% correct. That's the police officer spoke to a little bit earlier on. Coming from the Burnley area and being a teen in the early 90s, I saw this all too often with girls my own age. It almost happened to me. Thankfully, something in me knew it was dangerous. Sadly, a friend was caught up with a gang. Our lives took totally different paths. She's no longer with us. It just seemed to be acceptable back then, says Alison. What a sad message, Alison, and thank you for it. I appreciate you sharing that. M has been in touch and says the former cop you had on was brave. At the time, we, as all the British people, were unaware that this abuse was going on until whistleblowers like him came forward. It caused a public outcry. Fast forward 20 years, now we know it's still going on. We're told to ignore it. You know, we absolutely have to tackle it, this person says, and we're certainly not far-right fools, says M. I absolutely agree with you. I've never contacted you before, says this person, but says my partner was a social worker. Children and families in the area of Lancashire mentioned she was distraught by the refusal of the police to take action against the Muslim child abusers on her own, and with little support from her managers, there was little that she could do. Another very sad message from Lancashire there. Thank you for sharing it, whoever that person is. No name on it, as you can imagine. The problem is there are good people who want to do things. There are good people who want to solve problems and to help people, and often they can't because they are powerless, even if they're in positions which some people might see as powerful. You might think a detective sergeant in Lancashire Police would be able to solve things, but even Roger was unable to do that. We heard about that social worker who was unable to do that as well. And it's so sad, especially when you look back. And those people, including Roger, as we've heard, will feel real guilt in regard to what happened. We're going to continue talking about the story. We're not going to stop talking about it. This is the home of free speech. It's the home of common sense. And whilst these are my shows, they're also your shows. And if you want to talk about it, you let me know. I'm on tomorrow between 10 and 12:30. We're going to have, as always, a series of interviews. We're going to talk, hopefully, to the